Thank you for joining the podcast. Rabbi Sachs once said, "A Judaism divorced from society will be a Judaism unable to influence society. It will live and thrive and flourish behind high walls within its own defensive space, but it will not speak to those who wrestle with the very realities, poverty, disease, injustice, inequality, and other assaults on human dignity, to which Torah was directed in the first place. At best, those who engage with the world and are at the same time faithful to Judaism will be divided personalities, unable to integrate the two halves of their being because Torah and Chokhmah are unintegrated in our time. As Sephardim, we don't really relate to this statement as it applies more to the Ashkenazi communities. With that said, what is the traditional Sephardi approach to halakha? Do we take a more stringent or lenient approach? And what is the classical Sephardi approach to halakha and hashkafa in the context of the model of the modern world?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the program. I appreciate it. And Chazak Baruch and all your important work. The first thing I'd like to do is make a preliminary observation. Rabbi Sachs's comment is not off the wall. It's very perceptive. And I hate to tell you this, but it also applies to Sephardim. Why? And here's why I like the preliminary comment. When we speak about Sephardic life, Sephardic culture, Sephardic being, we have to take into consideration two different realities. There was a Sephardic reality pre-modern, let's say ending in 1900 even, where Sephardim lived in their own communities, whether in Syria or in Turkey or in Morocco, in Jerusalem, wherever we lived. And we had basically insular communities where we developed our own way of life, based on halakha, based on Torah, etc., which was different in certain fundamental ways from Ashkenazim who developed more in European lands. That's number one. But in the modern period, most Sephardim, and I include myself in the group, are already hybrid Sephardim. What do I mean? I mean, I grew up in the United States. I grew up in Seattle among Sephardim of Judeo-Spanish background. And it was a beautiful civilization, beautiful culture. My grandparents came from the old country. They spoke Ladino. It was a beautiful society. But I went to American schools. My wife, who's Ashkenazic, went to American schools. We listened to the same music. We read the same books. We're influenced by the same authors. And to a large extent, Sephardic life today is a combination. We're no longer living in an insular world, whether here or in Israel. There's already now a Sephardic Ashkenazic coming together. My basic theory is that 100 years from now, it won't matter if you're Sephardic or Ashkenazic. What will matter is that you should be Jewish. And what should matter is that each tradition, Sephardic, Ashkenazic, Yemenite, Italian, Greek, whatever it is, the best of all those traditions should find their way through the centuries so that our future generations will be stronger and happier. So I believe that the Sephardic tradition as it was pre-1900, let's say, has many valuable principles, very valuable ideas. But I believe also that instead of focusing on our ethnicity, we should be already in a post-ethnic mode. We should be thinking not about how Sephardim did it in Morocco or Turkey or Syria, but how our grandchildren and great-grandchildren are going to do it 100 and 200 years from now. So with that said, Rabbi Sachs, with whom I have great admiration, he was a great man, he says that there is a split, and you pointed it out that it's kind of an Ashkenazi split between maintaining a religious life on the one hand and a modern, outgoing activist life on the other hand. And maybe to some extent that was true 100 years ago. But for Sephardim and Ashkenazim of this generation, it isn't always true, and it doesn't have to be true. I mean to say this, the Jewish tradition essentially is an activist tradition. When God gave us the Torah at Mount Sinai, he didn't expect us to live in ghettos. He expected that the Midrash tells us that God gave the revelation at Sinai in 70 languages. Now the Israelites didn't know 70 languages. So what's the Midrash trying to tell us? The Midrash is telling us the Torah has relevance to all the nations of the world. So within our tradition, there already is this idea that Judaism has a message for everybody, not just for Jews, but for the world. So the idea of developing a wholeness is fundamental to Judaism in general. And the way the Sephardim worked in the olden days, I'm talking the pre-modern period, I think the great emphasis was on this wholeness. I think once we came into conflict with the modern period, Sephardim also started getting bifurcated. We also got just as confused as Ashkenazim, or getting as confused. So what's happening in the Sephardic world, as I see it, is two things. On the one level, people are moving further away from Judaism, thinking Judaism doesn't have the answers. They need to live a happy life. And on the other side, becoming more and more ethnic. We want to be more parochial, hang on to every single minhag. Whether it makes sense or not for our future generations doesn't matter. But we're Sephardic, we're Moroccan, we're Syrian, we're Turkish, we're Greek. And I'm not against ethnicity. I think it's fine. But I think the emphasis sometimes has to be beyond ethnicity. We're not just our own Turkish or Syrian or whatever we are. We're also human beings that are open to all the wisdom of the world. So when you go to your question, a traditional Sephardic approach to halacha. Well, I used to think, and I did a lot of research and I've written a lot on the subject, and I used to think there is such a thing as a traditional Sephardic approach, and I still do believe that. But I have to think, my thinking has become nuanced over the years. Sometimes people say, Sephardim are more lenient, Ashkenazim are stricter. Rabbi Ovadia used to say, Ovadia Yosef used to say, Sephardim are from Beit Hillel, Ashkenazim are from Beit Shammai. And in some stereotypical way, it might be true. But in reality, there are some Ashkenazic poskim who are wonderful and very open and very compassionate. And there's some Sephardic poskim who are very narrow and very machmir and everything. So I don't like to make any kind of generalization. Having said that, I'll make a generalization. And I'll make a generalization from the way I grew up. So I grew up in a community in Seattle of Judeo-Spanish Jews from Turkey and the island of Rhodes. In our community, there were people who were very observant and people who weren't observant at all. This was a very difficult time in history. These immigrants were trying to adapt to American life. They were trying to make a living. They were trying to raise families, a lot of conflicts. But I'm talking now about the traditional. I grew up, fortunately, among the traditional element of the community. My uncle was Rabbi Solomon Wyman. I grew up more or less in a religiously observant home. And that was the world that I came from. But we had no such thing as Haredism. The word wouldn't even resonate to it. Humot were completely out of the question. The idea was, you be a Jew, be happy. God gave us the Torah, God loves us, we love God, and live a happy, wholesome, beautiful life. I always thought that how could people live without Judaism? It's such a happy thing. It's so valuable. My mother used to make Shabbat lunch. We never used to call it Shabbat lunch, we call it Shabbat parties. Because we had not just our family, her children, her grandchildren, neighbors, and cousins, aunties, and uncles. It was a more extended family used to come, visitors come. It was always very exciting and very happy. And I think the one characteristic I remember most about growing up in Seattle was we never felt guilty about being things. We never felt guilty. We never felt we're sinners, we're horrible people. Even when we said Selichot, they were to happy tunes. We felt good. I was feeling, how can you sing? You're telling God you're saying that you've made all these terrible sins and you're singing about it? For Sephardim, it wasn't an anomaly. It was where God loves us. God wants us to repent. God wants us to live happily. So I grew up in that kind of tradition. So when you say Sephardim are more lenient or not lenient, I'm not sure that the question is leniency or not leniency. I would like to say traditionally, my imagination is Sephardim were more humane in the sense we kept all parts of life in focus. In the tradition I grew up in, the old timers, even the very religious old timers, sang love songs of Ladino. The romanceros were very popular. No one thought it was shameful or a question of tzniut. Women sang, men sang. It was very natural and religious. It wasn't, there were no lines. You go to synagogue on Shabbat and you sit next to one person who was a big Talmid Chacham, and next to him was a person who had a ham sandwich for breakfast, and no one said boo. No one said, you're better than me, I'm better than you, I feel guilty, I don't feel guilty. It was much more accepting and realizing that different people have different values and are on different levels, different rungs in the traditional sphere. Now, my heroes as poskim are Rabbi Ben Zion Uziel. I wrote a book about Rabbi Uziel, and his student, his disciple, Rabbi Chaim David Halevi. I also wrote a book about him. These are the two great, in my mind, the two great poskim of modern times among the Sephardim. When I read them, and Baruch Hashem, I knew Rabbi Halevi in person. When I read their works, and I spoke to Rabbi Halevi, these were quotation marks, old-fashioned rabbis. They didn't go to universities. They didn't read philosophy. but they had innate wisdom, common sense. So I always say this, sometimes you ask a rabbi a question, and the first thing they do is say, let me see what my book says. What does Shulchan Aruch say? What does Rambam say? What do the poskim say? Etc. But I think when you ask Rabbi Uziel or Rabbi Halevi a question, and I call this traditional Sephardic approach, the first thing they do is look in your eye. Why did you ask me that question? How will my answer affect your life? What is the implication of my research? What's going on in the human dimension? Not what do the books say, but what do you and I say? Then once we get a sense of the humanity of the situation and the implications, then we go to the books to find out what this rabbi said and that rabbi said. But there's a certain humaneness to it. I wrote an essay some years ago about Sephardic rabbinic leadership. It's on my website, jewishideas.org. And I started off with a quotation from Rabbi Ovadia Yosef when I was just still a young rabbi. This goes back many years. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef was Rishon LeZion, and he made a speech and came to New York, and he spoke about the Sephardic approach. And the Sephardim, as I said before, are Bet Hillel. We emphasize Chesed. Ashkenazim emphasize Gevurah. Ashkenazim are stricter. They're tougher. And of course, as a young rabbi, I was only too happy to hear that because it reflected what I grew up with, that kind of tradition. But as I studied more about it, I realized, as I said before, there are nuances. But I was trying to look at rabbinic models that I had in my own life, Sephardic and Ashkenazic. And I found that the Sephardic ones were also great Talmidei Chachamim, very learned, but they were very sensitive to human feelings. Not that the Ashkenazim weren't, the Ashkenazim also were. But the Sephardim had a certain nuance. First, let me give an example. When I was a young rabbi, I used to have to go to meetings and conferences and ladies groups and sisterhoods. And I thought, this isn't what I should do. I should be sitting down, I should be learning, I should be writing, I should be researching. So I went to my teacher, Chacham Solomon Gaon of blessed memory. The Chacham Gaon, do me a favor. Tell all these people to leave me alone. Let me sit and learn, let me read, let me write. Let me concentrate on what I can do best. To go to all these meetings, it's a waste of time. He looked at me, and I thought he would say, what a wonderful young man I have here. What a future great Talmid Chacham. He didn't say that. He said, I'm very disappointed in you. I said, what? You're disappointed that I want to learn and I want to write and I want to read and I want to teach? No, those are good things. But the community has to see a rabbi there with them. These people are giving their time. They're raising money for tzedakah. They're trying to run a synagogue. They're trying to work for this cause, for the state of Israel, this, that, the next thing. They need to see the rabbi there. The rabbi is not supposed to be an aloof person sitting in a room learning. The rabbi has to be a presence in their lives. Oh, I said, Chacham, you taught me something very important. To be a rabbi isn't just to be a brilliant scholar, although it's nice to be that if you can be it. It has to be a human being, a person who cares, a person who gives his life to the community. If you're not prepared to do that, don't be a rabbi, be something else. To be a rabbi in a community, you're obligated to understand the people, to spend time with the people, and that's not wasting time. That is your life. If you bring people closer to Torah, you have to understand who they are. This, to me, epitomizes in a nutshell something about, I call it Sephardic rabbinic mystique. When I was very young, before I was a rabbi, my wife and I was still in rabbinical school. We traveled to Istanbul, and we knew Rabbi Nisim Bahar, Allah Shalom, in Istanbul, great rabbi. And on Friday, he told us, I'm going to go shopping for before Shabbat. Come with me shopping. He stops at this store and he buys some tomatoes. He goes to the next store, he buys some potatoes. He goes to the next store and he buys some carrots. Every store. So I said, Rabbi Bahar, why are you stopping so many stores? You go to one place, you can buy all of them. He says to me, todos son judíos. All those people are Jews. They need to know the rabbi supports their parnasah. The rabbi cares about their business. Oh, that's a rabbi. That's a rabbi. Not the one who just sits in the Beit Midrash studying all day. That's good. Nothing, you have to study the Beit Midrash. But you have to be a human being. You have to care about people's needs. So when I talk about the Sephardic approach to halacha, that's what I focus on. The humane aspect of it, the bringing the law away from the books and into people's lives. That's what the key is. Okay, I'll stop at that point right now.
Yeah, and that's kind of what Rabbi Sachs was saying, that there's like this divorce between the yeshiva and the community in terms of how the rabbis kind of influence the society at large. So I think you really put it so well.
Nice.
You want to take on the next
Sure.
question?
Okay. So we live in an age where Judaism is highly fractured with sectarianism. We have the ultra-Orthodox, Hasidic, Orthodox, modern Orthodox, conservative, Reform, Reconstructionalist, Zionist, anti-Zionist, Messianic Zionist, secular Jew. Very little, if any, progress has been made in making headway into unifying the denominations of Judaism. How are we to lead a path to a Judaism that will one day be able to unify these fractures? And what has been the Sephardi approach that has allowed it to stay relatively uninfluenced by these movements?
Thank you very much. It's a good question. And I'm going to comment on it, but I'm going to comment in it two ways. Preliminarily, historically, Sephardim didn't have all these divisions. Again, I'm talking about in the 1800s and earlier. In all our old-fashioned traditional communities, they were solid communities. It didn't mean that we didn't have arguments. Sephardim are just as argumentative as Ashkenazim. We had dissents, we had people who believed this way, people who believed that way. But one thing that the whole community, whether they were more right-wing, more left-wing, they all held the community is the community. It stays according to halakha. And if individuals fear this way or fear that way, that's their business. But the kahal is always kasher. Everything that's done is according to the halakha. And that's the way it is. And didn't mean that people didn't all agree with that. But fundamentally, that was accepted in the society. Sometimes people say, well, Sephardim lived in backwards countries or in Muslim countries, they didn't know any better. False. Sephardim knew plenty well. Many of them lived in countries that were very Europeanized. They spoke European languages. Many of the countries they lived in were under European colonial rule. They knew plenty about all the conflicts that Ashkenazim had in their intellectual life. Sephardim had exactly the same conflicts. The difference was there was a tacit understanding. We hold to the tradition. Right, wrong, or indifferent, we're holding on to the tradition. We don't want all the division, formal divisions. Ashkenazim didn't have that. Ashkenazim, God bless them, whenever two people disagree, they make three synagogues. They have to have different movements. Okay. Ashkenazim were brilliant at organizational life. Sephardim less so, I have to say. Ashkenazim have made monumental accomplishments. Sephardim never did. I take nothing away from Ashkenazim. Having said that, Ashkenazim also, because of their maybe Europeanization or that living in Christian societies, they broke into different factions. Among the Christian world, how many different denominations in Christianity are there? Zillions. They're always fine. Muslims, okay, have two main ones. Okay, they fight against each other, but it's two. But the Christians, they split into many different groups. So Ashkenazim living in European lands tended to also break into different groups. And that's the way it was. Now, you say today, well, how are we going to unify all these groups? The answer is, forget about it. When the Mashiach comes, we'll be unified. When I was a younger rabbi, I spent many hours and hours. I was president of the Rabbinical Council of America, which is the Orthodox rabbinic group. And I had meetings with the head of the Reform movement and the head of the conservative movement. We used to have joint conferences and discussions, how we could find ways to bridge our differences. And after years and years of working, I came to the following conclusion. You're not going to do it. We're not going to do that. When Mashiach comes, we'll be united. So then, do we give it? Do we say, well, we'll throw up our hands and give up? No. What we have to do is develop our own philosophy, what we think Judaism ought to be. And we have to teach that. Those who listen, God bless them. Those who don't listen, God bless them too. Eventually, in 100 years from now, maybe they'll agree that we're right. There's no advantage in getting into discussions and disputes because we're never going to convince anybody. Our goal is find those souls who resonate to what we're teaching in the hope that little by little, one by one, we're going to be able to change the world. To change the world altogether, we're not going to do. It's a hopeless task. Forget about the whole world. Just concentrate on your family, your community, your society, your city, your group of people, and anyone who finds connections with you. And that's the way you're going to find unity. So Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik of blessed memory, who was a great figure of the 20th century, not just Ashkenazim, he was a great figure among Sephardim too. And I consider myself a student of his intellectually. He made a distinction between Jews who are Brit Goral and Brit Yehud Jews. Brit Goral Jews are Jews who are Jews by fate. They're born that way. They're stuck. They didn't choose to be Jewish. They're Jewish. They're Jewish maybe because anti-Semites make them Jewish. They're Jewish because they feel some national connection to the Jewish people. but they're not very tied into Mount Sinai. They don't really care about the mitzvot, but God bless them. They still have a strong Jewish connection somehow or other. These are also Jews. They have still a covenant, but they're also a covenant of breed Yehud, of people, Jews, so to speak, by choice, by the destiny, by our belief in Torah, by our belief in mitzvot. It's a positive choice, not because anyone forces into it, but because we understand that this is a beautiful, beautiful way of life. And both sets of Jews, whether they're more religious, less religious, they agree with us, they disagree with us, they're all start on the same team. The Havdil, when the anti-Semites in the world want to kill Jews, they don't say, are you Sephardic, are you Ashkenazic, are you Haredi, are you right-wing, are you left-wing, they hate all of us. It has no difference at all. So why should we let the anti-Semites define who we are? Instead of being defensive Jews, we should take the offense, so to speak. We should be offensive Jews in the positive sense of that term. We are Jewish because it's a practical, wise choice. We have a beautiful way of life, a strong way of life, a way of perpetuating values and traditions to our children and grandchildren that make us happy, make us fulfilled as human beings. And we're not going to give that for anything. And all Jews don't understand that. It's painful. And many were raised without proper religious training. And many, even who were raised in religious training, rebelled against it. They didn't have the right teachers, the right influences. My general philosophy is, I don't give up on one Jewish soul. I never give up on anybody. I'm ultimately an optimist. I'm an angel.
Okay.
I believe in optimism. Nobody is lost. Over the years, I've been a rabbi for over 50 years. I started when I was 24 years old in 1969. Goes back a long time. I've known many people who came from backgrounds that you would never guess anything, that they'd have any connection to Judaism, and either they or their children or grandchildren are good to upstanding Jews now. Don't give up on anybody. I had one interview with a student years ago. I was a reporter, actually, a Jewish reporter from some newspaper. I forgot which one it was. And after the interview, I asked him some questions about himself. And he came in with a kippah. He was apparently a religiously observant fellow. And he said he grew up in a completely non-observant home. He didn't even know he was Jewish. But he went to Columbia University and he took a graduate course in the Bible as literature. He came across an article written by somebody with the same last name as he has. So he went to his father, who is this person? Do we have any? Yeah, that was my grandfather. Your grandfather was a biblical scholar who wrote an article about Bible? Yeah, but we don't care. It's old fashioned. We don't care about that. But this kid's grandfather, who was dead for years, put his hand out over the generation and said, Sonny, come back. Your grandfather was a Torah scholar. Come back to the Torah. And the guy did. He came back. He learned. So I never give up on anybody. I've had so many cases over the years of people who came from very alienated backgrounds, very atheistic backgrounds, anti-Israel backgrounds. Okay, be patient. And God works in mysterious ways. And if we're patient and do our thing, that's all we can do.
So we can't, obviously, we're not trying to change anybody, but the risk that people might say, like, for example, we discuss, like, we want to have conversations with, let's say, a Karaite or a Reform rabbi, just to kind of see if we could find common ground, or we can understand each other's histories and learn to appreciate each other, because we're all Jews. But it could also send out a confusing message. It could also, you run the risk of maybe people becoming more attracted to another, sectarian group, so to speak. So there's always that kind of balance that you have to find. So how do you approach that? Because I actually really appreciated your interview with Rabbi Marc, I believe he's Reform, and he kind of has that approach where, bringing like a Jewish talk show where, Jews from all different denominations can come together and have discussions, meaningful discussions. How would you advise people like us in approaching, let's say, these different groups?
Excellent question.
It's a good question. I say, first of all, know thyself. Everyone's different. Different people are in different levels of development, different levels of thought, different spiritual rungs. Everyone's not in the same place. So for some people, if they hear a Reform rabbi speak, oh my God, I'm going to become a Reform Jew. I'm scared. Don't go to the speech. Don't. If you're nervous about it, stay home. You don't have to put yourself in a position of conflict if you don't want to. But if you're more confident, so to speak, you feel comfortable, there's truth in what everyone, I shouldn't say that, let me go back. Everyone doesn't have the truth, but sometimes there's sparks of truth in all traditions, believe it or not. Rav Kook wrote about the value of knowing about atheists and reform and anti-Zionists, because he says, even though we certainly reject their teachings, there's a spark, that something within their movements that stimulated intelligent people to follow it. Let's find what is their attraction and see how we fit that into our tradition. In other words, what does reform emphasize? Reform emphasizes personal autonomy. Well, that's a very nice value. In Orthodoxy, very often we're taught, what does the Rebbe say? What does the Chacham say? We follow that blindly. Reform, of course, rejects that. But most thinking Jews also reject that. Good, pious Jews aren't going to say, I close my eyes blindly. Whatever Rabbi so-and-so says, I'm going to follow. There are people that do that. There are Hasidim who follow the Rebbe. I'm not saying no, and God bless them. But for many, certainly secularly educated Jews who went to university, they're not going to think that way. So if I, as an Orthodox rabbi, want to bring those people back closer to the tradition, I have to understand where they are. I have to understand what values they have. How can I understand those values if I don't talk to them? If I don't read their writings, if I don't feel the connection with at least some of the virtues of them. If you go into a room thinking I'm right and you're wrong, there's no conversation. But if you go into a room and say, what can we learn from each other? Of course we disagree. I've had many meetings over the years with Catholic clergy, interfaith clergy. I was involved for years with interfaith projects. They knew ahead of time they're not going to convert me, and I know I'm not interested in converting them. The question wasn't that. The question is, what shared values do we have that can influence society for the better? I'm not going to here to argue with you or you to argue with me, but there are certain things we believe about family, we believe about morality, whatever we believe. Aren't there things that we share? Same text, same ideas, same principles, same values. Where we don't agree, okay, we don't agree. You're not going to convert me, I'm not going to convert you. That's not our goal. Our goal is to understand how we can draw on the humanity that we each have. I think that's how we have to deal with the conservative, reform, Karaites, whatever they are. I feel not only comfortable talking with people with different opinions, I consider it a positive value. I have learned so much from people who don't agree with me, who I don't agree with. Years ago, I spoke at a conference sponsored by the United Nations of all things, and it was sponsored by the government of Bahrain. And it was about religious tolerance. I was the only Orthodox rabbi in the room, but there were there was one other lady rabbi with a kippah from Italy, but everyone there was Muslim or Christian of some sort. And everyone spoke about brotherhood, sisterhood, and blah, 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 blah. So when it was my turn to speak, I said, you know what? One of the problems we have in our world is fanaticism. And fanaticism, a lot of it comes from the people in this room, our religions. We teach extremism. We're right, everyone else is wrong. How do we reach the level where we say, I am right. I'm willing to give my life for what I believe in, but I make room for you also. God is big enough for all of us. God created all of us. How can I develop a religious philosophy that is so big and so sophisticated that it makes room for people that I think are absolutely wrong, that they're on the wrong track, but that God still loves them and they're trying in their way to get to God without me having to kill them or them having to kill me. The great error of modern times has been the tyranny of people who believe there's one way and one way only. It's my way and everyone else is damned. I recently dealt with the conversion of a person who grew up as a fundamentalist Christian, who was taught from the time he was a child that Jews don't go to heaven. It's not possible. You have to be a Christian to go to heaven. Long and short of it, it's a long story. He wanted to marry a Jewish woman, and he came to me, boo, 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 boo. I'm not going to tell you the whole long story. But he eventually converted to Judaism, and he's a good Orthodox Jew. He puts on his tefillin every day. And it took him, he had a jump. And what made him jump from evangelical Christianity to Judaism was the idea, God is great enough to love all of us. Why would God reserve heaven only for one group? What kind of God would that be? Why could you believe in such a God? God should love, like we say, the righteous of all nations. That's a Jewish teaching. When he understood that, changed his whole hashkafa in life. And now his siblings, who grew up also with that teaching, they're all saying, yeah, maybe we should reconsider. In other words, how do we promote this idea that God, not look at the world from human view, try to pretend we're looking from God's point of view? God loves all human beings. God created all of us. Instead of us killing each other and saying we control God and we alone have monopolies on God, why don't we say God's big enough for all of us? If we only could get the world to that level, halavai amen, then that's pre-messianic already.
Beautiful. Well said. We totally agree.
What an important segment
Yeah.
that was.
And before we go to the next one, I just wanted to add that, we just finished Tisha B'Av recently, and we were always taught about, baseless hatred. And I find, maybe I'm wrong, but I find that like the Orthodox community always looks at that from the perspective of their own kind of bubble and says the disunity within our own group,
Yeah.
rather than looking at it as, seeing it beyond like reform, conservative, like we need to have conversations. We're a family, whether we like it or not. And every single Orthodox family that I know, or at least the more ultra Orthodox families, you have people who kind of go off the derech, and you're faced with a choice, either letting them, cutting them off, or dealing with it in different ways. And I feel like that is just, that's a reflection of the bigger problem. It's something that we're not dealing with as a nation. And I feel like, people like you need to really be heard by people, because it's such an important message.
Very important.
Let me give you a quick Devar Torah on Sinat Chinam. Years and years and years ago, we were in Jerusalem for Tisha B'Av. And I was walking through the old city and meditating and thinking, and suddenly I was going over that passage that the destruction of the temple was because of Sinat Chinam. And it struck me, what does Sinat Chinam mean? Baseless hatred. There's no such thing as baseless hatred. You hate somebody, you don't like his religion, you don't like his race, you don't like his looks, you think he did something against you. You don't just go to a person on the street and say, sir, excuse me, I hate you. No, there's no such thing. Everything has a base. So just a second, if there's no such thing as baseless hatred, what does Sinat Chinam mean? So I thought about it. Sinat Chinam means that we hate the chen of the other person. We hate to admit that the other person has chen, has something good about them. We hate to admit that. So when you say this person is Haredi, this person's Sephardic, this person's black, this person's white, this person's Chinese, and you hate them without understanding who they are, you refuse to see that they have chen. They also have something divine spark in them. They also have something beautiful about them. Once we hate to admit that, we shut the door between us and them. That's why the temple gets destroyed. In the temple days, what happened? There were sectarians, there were Kanaim, there were Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, there were different groups fighting against each other, and no one was talking with each other. They talked at each other. They didn't want to say, maybe there's some truth in what you're saying. Maybe there's some good in what you are. And once we block each other off, that's what Sinat Chinam means.
Amazing.
That's the theory.
So cool. We wanted to ask you also about the term modern Orthodox. What does it imply? The term has been very misunderstood, debated, maligned. Can you explain what the term means to you, and if it's an appropriate title?
The answer is, it is a very correct title, but of course, as you said, it's a very malign title. Judaism always was, in my humble opinion, always was modern Orthodoxy. What does that mean? It means, well, let me go back to something else. There was a French historian, Fernand Braudel. Braudel wrote a book, and in part of his book, he discussed a concept he calls world time. So right now, in the world that we're living in the Christian calendar, is 2022. That's world time. That's a chronological time. All advanced societies are living in 2022. But in world time, there are some societies that are 100 years behind, 200 years behind, or 500 years behind. They're more primitive. I shouldn't say the word primitive, but they're pre-modern. They're not with us. So some people want to live today in modern chronological time, and that's world time. And some people want to live in the past. Let me give a stark example, Hasidim, or Hasidim as they call them, right? Hasidim don't want to live in modern times. They want to dress like they dress in Poland and Russia. They want to speak the language that they spoke in Russia. They consciously don't want to be modern. That's a decision. There are other people who say, I want to live in the world today, chronologically, and I believe the Torah is so strong and so great that it can function and thrive in contemporary time. I don't want to live in the past. So Orthodoxy in general is very past-oriented. When we have questions, we say, what does the poskim say from the previous generation? What does Rambam say? What does the Shulchan Aruch say? We look backwards. But the greatest poskim are living into contemporary time. They're not living in the past. They draw on the wisdom of the past, but they're trying to understand the present. You can't give a psak about modern economy without knowing modern economics. You can't make a psak about should Israel go to war or not go to war unless you know military strategy or diplomacy. You can't make judgments about how people should live their lives if you don't know what's really happening now. So modern Orthodoxy means that we try to take into consideration not only the vast bulk of halakha that we have in the past, but we try to see it in light of modern contemporary wisdom, which is exactly what all the rabbis of the greatest rabbis of all generations have done. The Rambam was also modern Orthodox in that sense. He tried to understand what is the best science we have today and give psak based on what he knew today. He didn't base himself on what was known 2,000 years ago. He based himself today. Let me give a strange example. Years ago, when I was president of the Rabbinical Council of America, we were discussing the issue of brain death and organ transplantation. So one of the rabbis, great Talmid Chacham, says he quoted a rabbi from the 1800s, from the 1700s, who says that the definition of death is if the heart stops beating, and he quoted some interpretation of a pasuk to show that the life is the beating of the heart. So I answered, sure, that's exactly what the rabbi in the 1800s said, and that's what he thought. Kol hakavod, nothing wrong with that. But that rabbi had no idea what a ventilator is. He had never idea there was such a thing as heart transplants. He didn't know what a modern hospital looks like. How in the world can you give a psak today on the basis of what some rabbi said 200 years ago or 300 years ago, who has no clue and couldn't have had any clue about what our situation is today? A modern Orthodox rabbi says, if you ask me a question on brain death, don't go look in the poskim from Rambam. Rambam's not going to answer that for you. Go to the hospital, speak to a neurologist, speak to expert medical experts. Modern Orthodoxy means being as up to date on all the knowledge that you have to give proper guidance on issues that confront people today. Rabbi Halevi, I mentioned it before, he was asked questions about Israel. At some point, they had a trade of they traded Palestinian prisoners for some dead soldiers, Israeli soldiers. And there was a big tumult about it. And Rabbi Goren came out, it was asur, the government had no right to make the trade, etc. Rabbi Halevi answered, without going into details what they should or shouldn't do, he said, the only ones capable of making a psak in that kind of case is someone who's aware of diplomacy, who's aware of the military applications, who knows all the reasons that go into making such a decision. If you're just sitting in your baby drash, you don't know all the reasons. And therefore you really are not, even though you may be a great Talmid Chacham, you know Shas inside and out, you're not competent to judge in this case. And I think that would be my definition of modern Orthodoxy. Modern Orthodoxy, it has to be based on learning. It's not just a gimmick. It's not a giveaway. It's not a compromise position. It's fundamentally a real position. I think it's the correct position, the best position, namely, draw on the best of our Torah wisdom, but also the best of current wisdom, and come to a psak that are decisions that make the most sense given the contemporary situation. What we decide today, 100 years from now, they may decide something different. That's fine. Each rabbi has to decide in their generation what's right.
Modern Orthodoxy fundamentally then rejects the concept of Gedolim in terms of view Gedolim in the Haredi sense of
A rabbi said this 200 years ago, and therefore
no, it doesn't have to be 200 years ago. It could be even today. And even if the rabbi is not necessarily knowledgeable in specific areas, which would need be, however, the idea behind the Gedolim would be that, the holiness of this rabbi, or the fact that this rabbi is crowned a Gadol, whatever his psak is, divinely ordained,
infallible,
or whatever it is. We don't go with it.
I strongly disagree with that idea. I strongly disagree with that idea. Let me go back to my days as president of the Rabbinical Council in the beginning of the 1990s. I arranged conferences around the country of Orthodox rabbis to deal with the question of intermarriage. What do? We don't like it. We wish people wouldn't intermarry, but it's happening. So to what extent do Orthodox rabbis have responsibility? A couple comes, one's Jewish, one's not Jewish. Should we just throw them out the door? Should we talk to them? Should we try to convert? Should we try to break them up? What should we do? It's not a question that can be ignored. So we had the 5 conferences, and we were attacked bitterly by the right wing. Oh, it was a terrible time. So 2 Rosh Yeshiva from YU called me to the office. So I came to the office, and they said, "What right did you have to have these conferences?" I said, "I don't understand your question." He says, what Gedolim did you consult with before you had those conferences?" I said, "I didn't consult with any Gedolim. I have a brain of my own. We have committees of our own, and we're perfectly capable of making decisions. These are things we have to face. We're synagogue rabbis facing issues that you had no right to make that conference without first consulting a Gadol." I said, "Okay, let me come back to you. Would you please tell me the name of any Gadol who deals on a regular basis with people who want to convert to Judaism, who sits in the room with parents who are crying that their child is going out with a non-Jewish spouse, non-Jewish girl or non-Jewish boy? Tell me the names of who have practical experience dealing with these kind of cases." And then I'll go and ask the question. They said, "It's irrelevant. Gedolim know siyata d'shemaya. They know from God's." I said, "I don't believe that. I just can't. I don't know how you could believe that. I don't know how any intelligent person can believe that. They're just as fallible as we are." And the proof is the proof. During the late 30s, 1930s, and early 40s, the Jews in Europe had many Gedolim. They didn't tell the people to get out of Europe. They didn't tell the people to fight back. They didn't tell the people to join the Zionist movement. They didn't say go on Aliyah. They let the people die like crazy. So these were Gedolim that were supposed to be leading the people. They had the Tziyada Dishmaya. Where was it? There's so many different cases where so-called Gedolim, and who crowns them as Gedolim, that's another question. But there's so many different cases where they're just simply, they might be good, they might be intelligent, they might know all of Shas and all of Kabbalah, but that doesn't mean that they can make decisions that I want to choose for my life. I say without any apology that every Jew, whether rabbi or layman, has to think for him or herself. When you go to a doctor, the best doctors in the world, and they tell you you need to do A, B, and C, of course, you're a doctor, you take good advice, but you could also ask for a second opinion or a third opinion. You have to make the decision if you want this treatment or that treatment. Ultimately, you don't be blind. Don't just go in and say, well, whatever they tell me, I'm going to do. Often you go to a gadol or someone who knows a lot, and they do know a lot. Baruch Hashem, you draw on their wisdom, and I've consulted with many people who are much greater in Torah than I am, and I've learned much from them. And many times their ideas are excellent and they're helpful, but sometimes they're not. How could we expect a person who knows Shas in and out to be an expert on all medical technology, on the economic life, on political life, on relations between husband and wife, on how to deal with the children who are turning away? How could one rabbi know all those things? Can't. And it's a gimmick to think that the rabbi can. And I feel that's one of the deterrents that turn many thinking people away from Orthodox Judaism. They think Orthodox Judaism is a closed book that you're not allowed to think. And I started my institute years ago, Institute for Jewish Ideas and Ideals, specifically to create the idea or to foster the idea that Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, is intellectually vibrant, compassionate, inclusive. We want you to think. We want you to grow at your level. We don't want to tell you do this and then you have to do it because I told you so. No, I'm giving you good advice. But take it as advice, process it, think about it, apply it to your own life.
Two things I want to add to that is that, it seems as if in the world of the Gedolim, the leadership is dynastic, whereas that was never the case from going back to the Torah and the rabbis. But aside from that, I'm actually somebody who's very into, I study a lot about cults, and I notice, like, when I watch these documentaries, there's a common denominator that there's always a point where you have to shut off a part of your brain. And it's in every religion. It's in Judaism, it's in Islam, it's in Christianity. And I think that, what people tend to forget is that the Tselem Elohim, the intelligence, the divinely given intelligence that we all have is the one thing that separates us from the animal kingdom. So why should we ever turn that off? Why can't we think for ourselves? And people have this mentality sometimes where, like, no, you can't say that, or you can't think that. And like that's I feel like that's something that it's very hard to fight against that attitude because like it's such a rampant belief in among ultra Orthodox people. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that or to say to that.
It's not just ultra Orthodox. Orthodoxy in general, even the so-called
Right.
modern Orthodox, has shifted a lot to the right.
Yeah.
I was a rabbi of a Sheretz Israel in New York, the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue. From 1969, I started as a student rabbi, and I was there for 38 years as a rabbi. When I was 60 years old, I decided already I was going to transfer out of the rabbinate, which I loved. I had a wonderful congregation and a wonderful career. If I had to do it all over again, I would do it all over again. I couldn't have been happier. But I was feeling Orthodoxy was choking me. I was feeling that Orthodoxy was going in such a wrong direction. I couldn't stand it. So in the course of my life, I worked on all kinds of committees. I was president of the RCA, I told you. I can't tell you how many different organizations I was involved in, worked for. I felt, I'm getting choked. So I told the board, in 2 years' time, when I'm 62, that's going to transfer out and I'm going to become emeritus. And they were very cooperative. It was very, very wonderful. Why did I leave? I told you because I felt choked. And I founded the Institute for Jewish Ideas and Ideals. And I didn't even know we'd still be existing 15 years later. We still are. We publish a journal. We have teacher education programs. We do have a university network, blah, 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 all kinds of things. And we have a website that gets thousands and thousands of visitors, jewishideas.org. But I knew then, and I still know, that we're not going to win for a long time to come. Orthodoxy in general is not on our side. Orthodoxy in general is becoming less thinking, not more thinking. And unfortunately, those who become more thinking tend to drift more to the left. Instead of trying to hold on to the center, there's one movement going more and more left, but the much more movement moving more and more right. And so-called, what used to be called modern Orthodoxy, is afraid to talk for itself, where there's a visceral fear. When you say the word Gedolim, you don't think of modern Orthodox, you don't think of Rabbi Sachs as a Gadol, Rabbi Lamb, or other people. They're rabbis. Gedolim are old-time rabbis with long beards and black hats. That's a Gadol. You don't think Daniel Sperber is a Gadol Hador, or with Rabbi Halivni, Alav Shalom, was a Gadol Hador. These were also tremendous Gedolim. They knew tons. But in a popular mind, they're rabbis, or they're scholars. The Gadol Hador had to be old rabbis with long beards and black hats. And those are the ones that are the Gadolim.
They have to be divorced from the world to a certain extent.
Correct.
That's part of the point.
Correct, exactly.
That is the whole point.
That's what my fight is against.
I know.
And Baruch Hashem, we have people, thousands of people, but who follow us. But the vast majority is an uphill fight. And my basic thought as a rabbi and as a Jew, if you can't think for yourself, you're not going to be a good Jew. You've got to be able to think for yourself, process for yourself, take responsibility for your own life. And as you do that, you get the inner courage to really enjoy the Torah and Halakha. It's not them telling you, do this, don't do that, do this, don't do that, and you're being afraid every time you're going to move the wrong way, you're going to get zapped by God for doing a sin. That's not the Judaism I'm talking about. I'm talking about Judaism that is very humane. God created us to be happy and fulfilled human beings. He didn't create us to be scared automatons. He didn't create us to turn off our brains. And I think the more we think and the more we read, the more we interact with the world, including the more we learn Torah, of course, the stronger we are as human beings.
Meant to enhance life. It's not meant to restrict life.
What does that mean? It infuses us. It gives our life. It gives us life. It's not just something for the holidays, something to put on the wall to hang up as a certificate. It's fulfilling, but you have to do it yourself. If you don't do it yourself, you don't have the joy.
Wow, unbelievable. And I want to add, before we get to the last question, which is going to be short, but I just want to quote Rabbi Sachs again, because this is really related to what we were saying, and I love this quote. He said, "To my mind, the most serious issues confronting contemporary halakha is not lack of creativity, but the sociological divorce between the centers of Psak, nowadays largely the yeshivot, and the centers of congregational life. Psak involves applying Torah in its unchanging totality to Jewish life in its present specificity. A law interpreter, no less than a lawmaker, must have a clear objective understanding of the lives he is called on to instruct. Rabbi Yeshua once suggested that Rabban Gamliel's capacity to lead the Jewish community was compromised by his ignorance of the economic conditions in which they lived. The same surely would be true of a posek who was ignorant of their intellectual and cultural circumstances. So I want to end on another question relating to another phenomenon that's been going on in the last, let's say, a few hundred years, is the kollel kind of lifestyle. Because while there is a lot of value to someone like a Talmid Chacham honing his skills in a kollel, I want to know what your thoughts are, considering the following quote that I'm going to mention. The Rambam says, "Anyone who believes in his heart that one occupy oneself with Torah and not work, but support oneself with charity, behold, this one desecrates the divine name, dishonors the Torah, extinguishes the light of faith, brings evil to oneself, and forfeits life in the world to come, because it is forbidden to benefit from the words of Torah in this world." So what do you make of this statement?
I love the Rambam. All the so-called Gedolim and the Kollel leaders, they all know the same Rambam, but they say that was for those times. But Eid Lasod Hashem, and we live in emergency time, we need to have Kollels. So they dismiss poor Rambam, even though, of course, what Rambam says is very correct. But whenever they don't agree with the Rambam, they find a reason a way to get around him. Let me start with the following observation. People learning Torah, it's a good thing. People devoting their lives to understanding the Torah in a deeper way, kol hakavod. You can't argue with it. The question is, what's best for society as a whole, Jewish society as a whole, and what's good for the individual? So every individual is different. Let's forget Torah for a moment. There's some people who are physicists, and they spend their whole life in the physics lab, and they're supported by grants by the government. It's a kollel. They're supported by charities, so to speak, by university donors, and they devote their life to physics. No one says that's a terrible thing. Why? Because maybe they're going to come up with some great discovery. Maybe they'll come up with some good. They'll influence students. They'll raise better, great physics students. No one says there's anything wrong with that. Likewise, if there's a group of people that are devoting themselves day and night to the advancement of Torah study, like in the kollel, and they're being supported by the public, okay, the Rambam wouldn't like that as a way of life for everybody, but Rambam himself got income from his brother. His brother was a jeweler. I think Rambam himself depended, besides that he was a doctor, but before he was a doctor, I guess he got some financial help from his brother. It's not the end of the world. The problem isn't if there's a group of 50, 100, 200 people around the world who are devoting themselves morning, noon, and night to learning Torah, and these are elite, brilliant scholars from whom we can expect great contributions, great writings, great teachings. They'll establish yeshivot. You can't condemn that. The problem is when this becomes a way of life that involves hundreds, thousands of students of men who don't earn livings, and some of whom are quite learned and quite capable intellectually of learning all day, and others who are not, but they just go along for the ride because that's what's expected from them. And it's also very unfair to women who are thought you have to come from a rich father in order to get a good shidduch, because these guys aren't working for a living. So how are you going to pay? If you have 10 kids, who's going to pay for those kids? So you need to have some source of income. So women are stuck having kids and having to earn money and having to have a rich father or grandfather to help support. The whole system is very problematic in many, many ways. It's not up to me to judge how other people should live their lives. Let them all live the way they want. But it seems to me that at some point the system's going to break down. It's going to break down because it's on a fundamentally flawed basis. To have some expert physicists, great people in the lab learning all day, we all need that. Great medical researchers, that's fine. And great Talmudists, that's also fine. But to try to expand it to have thousands and thousands of people not working in a productive way and having that leading their lives in such a way that they have to live in poverty or live off charity is a disgrace to Torah. Did God give us a Torah so we should be beholden to other people for charity? See, Rambam writes very harshly, very strong, but ultimately it is a chilul Hashem. I'll go back to a question that Rabbi Halevi got from there was a yeshiva bocher in Israel, Bachur Yeshiva, wanted to get married, but neither he nor his bride-to-be have any money. and their parents don't have any money, but they want to get married. So he went to Rosh Yeshiva, and Rosh Yeshiva says, here's a note, go around and snore and say you're getting married, you need money to get married. And the kid just feels very bad. I have to go begging people to get money to get married. Felt very bad. So he came to Rabbi Halevi. And Rabbi Halevi, basically, the same spirit of this Rambam says, it's a shame in our day and age that yeshiva students are identified with poor people who have to go begging for money. And it disgraces the Torah. Everyone thinks, you must be poor, you must be unproductive, you must be a parasite. So instead of making people feel Torah is wonderful and strong and valuable source of life, it's for parasites, it's for people that are losers. Mm-hmm. So he says that, so Rabbi made a suggestion, which of course no one liked. His suggestion was all the Rosh Yeshiva should get together and they should, next to every yeshiva, there should be a factory, some sort. And all the Bachurei Yeshiva should learn and they should spend 4 or 5 hours a day in the factory and they should get paid. And the pay should not be given to them. It should be put in escrow. So when they want to get married, they already have a bank account. They already have money in the bank account. It was very practical. But Rabbi Halevi was really tackling with this idea to have a whole generation of young men not being trained to hold jobs or be responsible in society is a disgrace to Torah. It's not an honor to Torah. It's a disgrace. It means Torah people can't function in the society. Torah people have to depend on the charity of others. This is not healthy. So yes, we need some kollel type of people. And throughout generations, from the beginning of time, before there was such a thing as kollels, there always were people who were very learned and who were supported by their communities. And kol hakavod, that's fine. But when you have it such as a mass movement where people feel they must work in this system, that's a problem. I was once at a restaurant and a mashgiach comes to me, Rabbi, I have a big problem. What's your problem? My problem is I have a son who's 25, but he works. I said, what's the problem? He can't get a shidduch because he works. The girls only want someone who sits down and learns all day. Is this normal? Is this healthy? No. This is a sick society. It's an inversion of the way things are supposed to be. So I think God gave us Torah Chaim, Torah to live in this world, live properly, live religiously, but live as a human being. Don't live as a vegetable. Don't live as a robot. Don't live as on the side. Live a full whole life.
And to just end on this point, I just want to add that in Israel, we see the result of this mentality or this approach to Judaism as, like I think the majority of the poverty-stricken people in Israel are the Haredi community who adopts this lifestyle. And unfortunately, I think it comes from maybe magical thinking that like Torah in itself will sustain.
God will provide. God will provide.
God will provide. And I think there's a famous, just to end on this, there's a famous Agadah in the Talmud, which talks about, the famous one of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai when he goes into the cave with his son. I think people miss the overall message of that story, that he's railing against, kind of seeing the positive side of the material world and, the world of the roads that the Romans built. He only looked at the negative. And then even after he came out from the cave, he was actually punished. He was sent back into the cave. People see
he got thrown back.
He got thrown back. He
wasn't able to see the world for
what it is. And he sees a person working the field and doesn't understand why they're not learning Torah. And then God sends him back. He punishes him. And they're really telling us that the point of it all is that the world, and previous guests have mentioned this, that the author of the Torah is also the author of the world, and we have to remember that we can't separate the two. They're one. So thank you so much for joining us. This was amazing.
So important. These segments are so important. We thank the rabbi so much for his time.
Thank you so much, and kol hakavod on your important work.
Thank you so much. We appreciate that.
We'll send you a copy of this soon.
That'll be terrific. Thank you so much.
All right.
Shalom, shalom. Be well.
You too.